Hello, my name is Kelly Jones, and I'm a manager of technical services and veterinarian with Ceva Animal Health. I do some turkey work in the U.S., and I just wanted to share with you some of my experiences on how to best optimize immunization through proper vaccination in turkeys. Just an overview of the talk. I'm going to do a brief introduction of why it's important to have this talk. Talk about the drinking water and how vaccination and drinking water really goes on. Talk about cold chain, farm prep to get ready for vaccination in your flock, vaccine mixing, how to vaccinate the birds, checking the vaccination, and then lastly, how to manage coccidiosis vaccination on the farm through your farm management system. Vaccination does not mean immunization. Let me make that perfectly clear. To go through a process of vaccination does not mean that you're actually immunizing your birds. That's not what we want. So let's talk about how to get around that. When we discuss optimizing immunization in turkeys, we're really talking about how to optimize drinking water vaccine, right? I don't want you to wait on an audit. I do a lot of vaccination audits, and I find things that if you just pay attention to the process, you look at your SOPs, read the manufacturer's instructions, you'll catch a lot of things. But don't wait on an audit. After this talk, you'll be able to start now and catch a few things that you may or may not have been doing and improve your process. The goal is to get it right the first time, every time. Your aim is for every bird to be exposed at the same time. Because remember, a missed bird is an unvaccinated bird. I want you to go through the proper motions every time. I know everyone's busy, we're tired, we have a lot of stress with COVID, things going on, but it's very important to go through the proper motions every time. You want to think of vaccination like an investment. All the time and energy and even money that goes into vaccination equals money out. That's why we do it. A proper vaccination will yield a profitable flock, no doubt. So where do we start? Clean water into the birds, okay? Most of our vaccination in commercial turkeys is done in the drinking water. So it makes sense that we start there. This requires a strong focus on the drinking water. We, of course, want fresh and clean water, free of disinfectants, no impurities at the time of vaccination, right? Why? Because vaccines are live organisms, and you have to pay attention and preserve their life. Their viability is critical. Stabilizers can help prevent this, denaturing of vaccine organisms, so those are really good to have on hand. And you want to make sure your water sanitation is discontinued within about 12 hours prior to vaccination. Again, all to help preserve viability. But is cleaning the water enough? If you've ever seen me give a talk on vaccinating turkeys or turkey health, you know I always want to attack the biofilm too. I have to talk about water sanitation and water line sanitation. Of course, you want to start with clean water, but you've got to look at the biofilm as well. Why? Because the biofilm harbors bacterial and viral organisms. It also contains contaminants that might, again, denature your live vaccines. So it's really important to not only clean your water, but also your water lines. The other thing is, if you have a high biofilm already in your drinker lines, that window is wide open for proliferation when you turn your water sanitation off. Consider a continuous water line sanitation program. Those that have my eye right now are the chlorine dioxide systems. There's various brands and various systems out there depending on the size of your operation. But what this does, it lowers the risk of biofilm development during your sanitation, when your sanitation is off, and it keeps levels minimal. You want to maintain this before, but not during and after, okay? So continuous waterline treatment outside of vaccination, but go ahead, remember, and turn this off about 12 hours prior to vaccination. Let's move into cold chain of vaccines. I've seen various techniques, and basically, you know, they all work as long as they're within manufacturer's recommendations, okay? How do we maintain cold chain? Well, you can monitor critical control points. It starts at the supply cooler back at the office and your warehouse. You've got to make sure that anytime you store these products, it's within the guidelines of the manufacturer. You need some kind of routine temperature monitoring, either of the cooler or the actual, in the actual area that you're storing your vaccines themselves. If cold chain is disrupted, the viability of the vaccine is at risk, period. Perform appropriate inventory and storage of vaccines. The older cereals, of course, you want to move forward when anything new arrives. So always use your oldest vaccines first. But you don't want to use them too old. So ensure that they're still within expiry. Record your serial numbers, expiration dates for every bottle, and record the number of bottles that go to each farm. That way, if you have concerns down the road, you can always have records to examine if you need them later on. What about preserving cold chain beyond storage? Well, during handling and transport to the farm is still just as important. You only want to remove the amount of vaccines for that particular day's vaccination. You want to record the number of bottles removed and where exactly they're going. But again, take only what is needed. You want to place the vaccines directly in the transport cooler, either with frozen ice packs or ample amount of ice. And again, follow manufacturer's recommendations. I keep saying that, but what is it? So temperature of about 35 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit is what most folks are recommending. And if you can pre-cool the cooler instead of having, say, a hot cooler from outside, that's always better. I like to use these temperature guns or probes just to help monitor the transport temperatures of the coolers and make sure that they're in line with manufacturer's recommendations. All right, let's move to farm prep. Farm prepping for vaccination is absolutely one of the most critical steps in the process. We already discussed discontinuing water sanitation at least 12 hours prior to vaccination. But think about this too. We want the birds to be thirsty before vaccinated water is ever offered. If you think about when turkeys drink most of the water, it's within the first few hours of daylight. So drinking water should be turned off early enough for birds to drink most of the water out of the line, well before vaccination. Water vaccination should take place first thing in the morning to capitalize on that first few hours of daylight when the turkeys drink the most. So the goal is to, with water restriction, ensure that the first drink of the day for all of the turkeys is vaccine water. So how do we do that? Well, if you have water lines, you want to raise, drain, and prime the water lines with the vaccine water prior to lowering it back down for the birds to access. 5-gallon buckets at the end of lines work well to help drain the lines. You'll be surprised how much water, even after supposed water restriction, you actually get from the line. Prior to mixing up vaccines, just make sure that your containers, your reservoirs, your pump systems are all cleaned. And if you do use cleaners, make sure they're thoroughly rinsed out, because we wouldn't want to harm, again, the viability of vaccines. I just want to stress this, that you've got to raise your drinker lines. This is the most commonly missed step in the process. We want thirsty turkeys to have their first drink of only vaccinated water. So, moving to vaccine mixing. You want to fill the water reservoir with approximately 25 to 40% of the bird's daily intake. Now, this will vary depending on how old the birds are, how warm or cold it is outside or in the barn. So just a good rule of thumb, about 1 to 3 hours worth of water. You also want to include, again, that stabilizer to help ensure that nothing denatures the vaccine. You want to mix the vaccines per label directions with preferably distilled water. And it's good practice to actually use a small separate bucket, as like shown in that picture down at the bottom, and make sure that the vaccines are, released from the vial and dissolve quickly. A good trick for this is to actually open the vial under the water, and a rush of water into that vaccine vial will actually help to release and dissolve the vaccine. I also like to rinse the empty bottles in that water to ensure that all the vaccine is flushed from bottles. So when you're talking about as the small of particles as we are with things, especially like viral vaccines, it's really important to get every particle off of the inside bottle wall. You want to add vaccine water bucket to a larger reservoir and mix well. So this is an image here of some sort of submergible pump. Or a stirring apparatus works well, whatever works. Then you add your dye and make sure everything is stirred well. I like to add the dye last because it really gives you a reassurance that everything is properly stirred and mixed up well. So then you want to turn on your pump. You want to flush your drinkers while they're still raised until dye appears at the end. Again, use your bucket, use your hand under the drinkers, look for the pipe at the end of the barn, and make sure that all of the lines are primed. Only now are birds ready to be vaccinated, okay? So go ahead and vaccinate. Once the drinkers are lower, the birds should be ready to drink the vaccine water. Okay, they're gonna be thirsty, they're ready to drink. And this is the goal. You want those birds on the drinker line. Okay, just about 100% of the birds getting their first drink of water. If birds are not on the drinker, you can stir them by walking the flock. But really your vaccine reservoir should empty within no more than 4 hours. And really that's pushing it after access. The reason this is important to really try to encourage drinking within a few hours is that this is the time when most live vaccines start to lose viability outside of their cold chain. You should be able to return the water sanitation on within about, I would say, 3 hours after reservoir completely empties. Please don't forget this step, because after all your hard work of your continuous water sanitation, I would really hate for that biofilm to take advantage of the opportunity to overdevelop. So remember this, please. All right, moving on to checking the vaccination. So how do we know the turkeys are vaccinated? Very simple. We have dye in the line, let's take advantage of it. So let's do tongue checks to determine the uptake of the vaccine. How many? I like to do about 100 birds and just randomly conducted through the barn. If you don't want to do, the tongue checks, you can look even at the crops, and you can sometimes see the blue dye through the skin of the crops. But you only want to check this very soon after vaccination. This isn't something that you can come in tomorrow and do, because the dye is only temporary on the tongues and in the crops. Every bird without dye should be considered a missed bird, okay? So monitoring will help you identify any opportunity where you can improve your process of uptake of the vaccine. The other thing I want you to encourage you to do is to welcome audits by others. Some of us out there really enjoy working with you on maximizing this water vaccination process. We see, what folks are doing all over the country. So we may see something that you would never see because you're doing it every day. So I encourage you to, welcome third-party audits. Just get a fresh eye in there. I think you'll be really surprised by some opportunities that they'll discover. So just to review before we move on, the keys to successful water vaccination, of course, clean water system. That is the whole system, biofilm included. We do not want vaccine care and stabilization all the way from when that vaccine gets delivered to your facility, all the way until it ends up in the mouth of that bird, okay? We want the birds off water and also thirsty. So work to do that. How you want all the drinkers charged prior to bird access so that their first drink of the day has vaccine in it. You want them to consume really within about 3 hours of first drink, and that's to maintain the viability. And remember, every bird must drink for your vaccination program to be a success. Now let's move on and talk about optimizing coccidiosis vaccination through on-farm management. Now, you may say, well, you know, my coccidiosis vaccination is done at the hatchery. So I don't need to worry about it on the farm. But remember, about 80% of coccidiosis vaccination actually occurs on the farm and is affected by what you do as a manager. You really need recycling of these vaccine oocysts, and you need them to infect and shed at least 3 good times. So if birds cycle, give or take weekly, the focus really needs to be on the first 3 weeks of life. So birds shed vaccine oocysts that are what we call unsporulated, so they're not infected. Once in the environment, they undergo a process called sporulation, where they become infective to activate yet another life cycle. So what do oocysts need to undergo sporulation? Moisture, heat, oxygen, much like our bird eggs need in a hatchery to become chicks, our oocysts or our cocci eggs need these elements to develop into infective organisms. You want to try to target your litter moisture. We don't need a lot of moisture, but 20 to 35% is probably a good rule of thumb. And density control can help ensure that birds are shedding oocysts in the proper areas, as well as help you kind of increase or decrease your moisture in that litter. Now, the reason we need a good 3 cycles at least is for a protective immunity to develop. A bird really needs more of a trickle infection over and over again to stimulate enough immunity to be protective against a bite later. So this is just an image to show that just first cycle, shed a little, second, shed a little more, third, by the third cycle, their immunity is pretty close to 100%. So again, once you reach 3 weeks, you're pretty much where you need to be. So let's talk about field management. 2 key tasks after vaccination need to occur. Number 1, control the reinfection. You want to promote the ingestion of oocysts. Now, take advantage of the fact that turkeys are the most curious creature on the planet. Use attraction methods. You want to also manage your fecal access. So to uptake oocysts, they have to uptake their feces. So you need to make sure you're seeding the barn or the space that they're in appropriately. And we'll talk about some tricks for that. You want to control the sporulation. So to do that, again, we need those certain elements, the heat, the moisture, the oxygen. So an ideal surface moisture of the litter is required. You also need that relative humidity to be dialed in, so you're not wicking that moisture away from the feces. So just some good target numbers there for you to take note of. Nothing carved in stone, but again, just some good parameters. So how do you manage your barn exposure appropriately? So if you keep in mind the fact that cocci have about a 5 to 7 day life cycle, you just want to try to split the cycle with anything you do to the birds. That includes when you turn out or increase their space. So, ideally, we want to see the entire length of the barn as early as possible. Now we know turkeys need some containment, generally very young, to just get them off to a good start. But once those guys are really off to a good start, go ahead and encourage them to explore more of the lengths of the barn. Now, when we think about half-house brood, we generally think about this top picture here. But where we've seen a lot of success and a move towards is more half-house down the length of the barn. This is a lot more forgiving about when to exactly turn out, feeding the barn, and still keeping those birds confined enough to get them off to a good start and to, through density control, manage your litter moisture. The other thing method I've seen a lot of folks doing is this 1/3 house brooding, where they're in a third of the barn, either on this side wall or that. The other side has no light, no food, no water. So again, you can use attraction methods or lack of attraction methods to kind of encourage these birds to move where you need them to be. Here's some examples of how folks have managed fecal exposure. So bird density, you can use the rings or the paper guards, and here's different examples of that. Attraction methods. So we know that birds will go towards light. They also love this paper here, right? Feed, you can use the fact that there's feed in certain areas to attract birds to those zones. This is an example. This is actually a breeder pullet barn, but I thought it really demonstrated what the take-home message was about third house brooding. When we walked in the barn, this set of lights was out. There's no feed, no water on that side of the barn. Now they did have this little guard down through the first 4 days of life, but after 4 days, they released it and brought it up. What do you notice? These birds still, these are like 11, 12-day-old birds. They're still only on that side of the barn because that's where their attractions are, their feed, their water, and all the lights were on that side. So be creative. I encourage you to use the turkey's inquisitive nature and really kind of direct them in the barn where you want them to go. Other attraction methods, we mentioned paper. Here's just some examples of that. I love paper, especially if it's new paper. You can utilize paper or feed, especially around their cycle and shed periods of about weekly. You just don't want to make sure you don't take this up right when they're shedding and uptaking, because you will actually be removing a lot of the feces. This is a picture. Again, it's chickens, but it demonstrates the fact that don't put in your mind that you have to have the whole entire barn a certain moisture. That's never going to happen. What we want is a moisture level we can work with where the birds are hanging out, because where they're hanging out is going to be where they're shedding and uptaking their feces. So where the birds are, we want to target again, kind of in that 20 to 30%. Okay, so don't worry about this dark, cold side wall over here where there's no birds. We just want to kind of be where the action is here. So just the general field management. We didn't really talk about it, but I wanted to just remind you, do no harm, okay? If something has anticoccidial properties, don't really touch it under 3 weeks of age, okay, without consulting your veterinarian. Certain antibiotics you probably wouldn't even know, like tetracyclines, sulfonamides, essential oil products, especially anything with the word anticoccidial on the label, like amprolium. Just avoid it if you can, unless your veterinarian specifically directs you in that way. Also avoid simultaneous stressors during the cycling. For instance, something like HE vaccination is an added intestinal stressor. So it makes sense to try to wait at least until the turkeys have their peak cycle and shed and uptake periods. So if you can wait till after 3 weeks, that's great. If not, just again, keep in mind what those turkeys are going through with their cocci cycle. Manage your fecal exposure. So you can do that through adjusting your bird density, and which therefore will create extra litter moisture or manage your litter moisture, your air moisture. Move the birds appropriately. We talked about seeding the barn, preferably through the length of the barn as early as possible. Utilize those attraction methods that we talked about. One of the last things I want to talk about is to know when to help, okay? Pay attention to the birds and react accordingly. You know, birds that are going through a cocci cycle, the first thing they do is they become anorectic. They go off feed. They start to vocalize. You can often hear them when you drive up right outside the barn, just screaming. They'll pace or they'll do the opposite and huddle and sit down. They'll potentially have watery droppings or diarrhea. They'll have ruffled feathers and just general unthriftiness and depression. So I want you to watch the bird behavior and know that it is completely normal, depending on the cycle stage that the birds are in, for you to see vaccine reactions. And what I mean by vaccine reactions are just bird discomfort. I want you to encourage feed uptake. That's critical in keeping birds from uptaking litter and harmful bacteria. You know, run the feeders, walk them, feed on paper, offer attractants. All of that is helpful. But also consider adjusting the temperature just up 2 degrees if birds are looking like they're cold or febrile. If you see huddling, they're cold. I don't care what that barn temp says. Pain management options. Address the dysbacteriosis. You know, consult your veterinarian for possible products that you might be able to use. A lot of them have synergistic properties. And Prolium, of course, is suggested if you have excess mortality or a cocci break, but again, only under veterinary guidance, because these oocysts are extremely sensitive, so little goes a long way. Key success factors: proper vaccination. You know, I know it begins at the hatchery. We want to give a full dose to fit healthy poults, but I want you to understand how your management in the barn affects vaccine success. Don't interrupt, hinder, delay any of the cocci vaccine cycle. I want you to recognize successful immunization and the fact that it takes a good 3 weeks. Understand the cycle stages and know when to help birds through reactions when you see them. And consider monitoring tools. Ceva offers OPG counts to kind of watch how those birds are cycling, and which is helpful to fine-tune your brood setup and your management. And then ask for help. You're not in this alone. There's a lot of us out there that really enjoy working with coccidiosis and enteric health. So reach out to us for help and assistance with this. That's all I have today. I want to thank you, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you, and have a great day.